She looked at me with that commanding gaze and said, "You should call me ma'am." I smiled, leaned closer, and whispered back, "I'd rather call you mine." From that moment, nothing between us felt the same. When I first walked into her office, I thought I had stepped into another world. Everything about the space carried her presence, the polished desk, the neatly stacked folders, the faint scent of jasmine in the air. But it wasn't the office that caught me off guard. It was her. She sat behind the desk with the kind of composure that only years of experience can shape. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that revealed the graceful lines of her face, and her voice, calm, low, and deliberate, immediately commanded my attention. She wasn't just someone in charge. She was someone who carried herself like she had weathered storms and walked away stronger every time. When she introduced herself, I almost missed the words because I was distracted by the quiet intensity in her eyes. They weren't just sharp, they were observant, studying me as though she could already see past the surface. My heart skipped once, maybe twice, though I told myself it was just nerves on my first day. She gave me my first task, nothing complicated, but as she explained, her tone shifted ever so slightly when I nodded too quickly. "Don't rush," she said softly, but firmly, her gaze locking onto mine. It wasn't a reprimand, not really. It was more like a reminder that in her world, precision mattered. And yet, beneath her authority, there was something else. A flicker I couldn't quite name. Maybe curiosity. Maybe recognition. Whatever it was, it lingered in the silence between her words, in the way her lips curved almost imperceptibly when I answered with more care the second time. As the day went on, I caught myself noticing things I shouldn't. The way she tapped her pen lightly against her notes when she was thinking. The faint trace of perfume that seemed to follow whenever she passed by my desk. Even the sound of her heels on the floor carried a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I told myself she was my boss, nothing more. But still, when her eyes found mine across the meeting room that afternoon, holding just a fraction too long before turning away, I felt something stir. Something I hadn't expected on my first day. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even attraction in the usual sense. It was a spark, quiet, hidden, and dangerous in its simplicity. The kind of spark that could stay buried forever, or ignite something neither of us were prepared for. The first few days passed quietly. She kept things professional, her words clipped and precise, her instructions always clear. But the more time I spent near her, the more I began to notice the unspoken layers beneath her calm authority. And I think she noticed something in me too, the way I paid attention, the way my eyes lingered on her a moment longer than they should. It all came to a head one afternoon in the conference room. We were going over reports, the air heavy with the usual silence of concentration. I spoke up, perhaps a little too casually, addressing her by her first name. It slipped out before I even realized it. Her eyes lifted immediately, sharp and steady. "You should call me ma'am," she said. No anger, no sharpness, just a simple correction, spoken with that steady authority of hers. The room stilled, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I should have apologized. I should have nodded, accepted her rule, and moved on. But something inside me resisted, not out of disrespect, but because the word didn't feel right on my tongue. It felt like a wall I wasn't ready to put between us. So I smiled, leaning just slightly forward, my voice low enough that it carried only to her. "I'd rather call you mine." The words surprised even me as they slipped out, softer than a confession but heavier than a joke. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Her hand froze mid-note, her pen pressed against the paper without moving. Her lips parted, just barely, as if she had an answer on the tip of her tongue but couldn't decide whether to let it out. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth, small, controlled, but impossible to miss. She shifted her gaze back to the papers, continuing as though nothing had happened. But it had. The moment clung to the air between us, invisible but undeniable. Every word she spoke afterward felt laced with a new undercurrent, as though we were playing a quiet game that no one else could see. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers drummed against the table more than before. And when our eyes met again, the stare held a question neither of us dared to ask. It was just a single exchange, a fleeting moment in a room full of people. Yet it changed everything. I could feel it in my chest, the way my heart beat faster every time she looked at me. And I knew she felt it too, no matter how carefully she tried to hide it. This wasn't just work anymore. This was the beginning of something dangerous, and neither of us had the power to pretend otherwise. It was late on a Thursday evening when I realized she was still in the office. Most of the team had gone home hours ago, and the building had fallen into that strange kind of silence where every sound feels amplified, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint buzz of the lights overhead, the occasional creak of the wooden floor. I passed by her office, meaning only to collect my things, but I stopped when I saw her through the glass. She wasn't the same woman I knew from the daytime, not the poised, commanding presence who gave directions with sharp precision. Tonight, she sat with her shoes slipped off, her hair let down in soft waves that framed her face. Her blazer rested on the back of her chair, leaving her in a simple blouse that clung gently to her shoulders. Her posture was different, too. Instead of straight-backed and composed, she leaned forward, elbows on the desk, her fingers pressed lightly against her temple. She looked tired. Human. And for a moment, I felt as if I were intruding on a side of her the world rarely got to see. I knocked softly on the doorframe. Her head lifted, startled, but when she saw it was me, the tension in her eyes softened. "You're still here?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual edge. I stepped inside, offering a half-smile. "I could ask you the same." She gave a small laugh, though it sounded weary. "Paperwork doesn't finish itself." She gestured vaguely to the stack beside her. I sat down in the chair across from her, not saying much at first. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different, slower, deeper, as if we were both aware that this moment wasn't part of the usual routine. Her eyes dropped to the desk, then back to me. For the briefest second, I thought I saw something flicker there, not just exhaustion, but vulnerability. A glimpse of the woman behind the title, behind the walls she had built so carefully. I didn't try to fill the space with words. Instead, I let the quiet stand. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything else. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in her position, not in mine, but in the fragile thread that connected us. I saw her not just as my boss, but as a woman, strong, yes, but also carrying burdens she rarely let anyone see. That night, nothing happened. No touch, no confession. But when I left her office, I carried with me the weight of her unspoken vulnerability. And somehow, it made the spark between us feel even more dangerous. Even more real. The following week moved in a blur of meetings and deadlines, but that night in her office stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of her hair loose, her shoulders softened, her eyes revealing a quiet weariness she rarely allowed. It made her feel closer, more real. And with that closeness came something neither of us could quite avoid. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm, the faint tapping of keyboards, the muted ring of phones, the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. I had been asked to bring her a folder, a stack of reports we had just finalized. Nothing remarkable. Just another task in the endless list of tasks. But the moment shifted when I stepped into her office. She looked up at me from her desk, her expression unreadable, her eyes carrying that same mixture of authority and something softer I couldn't name. I placed the folder on the corner of her desk, and just as I did, she reached out at the same time. Our hands met over the papers. It should have been nothing. A simple touch, a brief contact, the kind of accidental brush that happens 100 times in a busy office. But it wasn't nothing. Her skin was warm against mine, softer than I imagined. My fingers froze where they touched hers, and for a heartbeat, neither of us pulled away. The silence in the room thickened. She glanced at me, a quick, searching look, as if deciding whether to reclaim the space between us. But she didn't. Instead, her hand stayed against mine just a moment too long, the faintest curl of her fingers brushing against my knuckles before she finally withdrew. The moment was over in seconds, but it left behind a pulse in my chest that wouldn't slow down. She cleared her throat, shifting the papers neatly, her voice measured. "Thank you," she said, almost too softly. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but inside, my thoughts were anything but calm. That single touch had spoken louder than any words we'd exchanged. I walked out of her office with my hands still tingling, every nerve alive. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Because in that fleeting brush of skin, I felt the truth we were both trying to ignore, that whatever this was, it was growing, and neither of us knew how much longer we could pretend otherwise. It was late again, the kind of night when the building felt abandoned, the halls stretching out in silence, every sound echoing like a secret. She and I were the only ones left, papers spread across the conference table, the glow of a single desk lamp painting the room in soft gold. We worked quietly at first, but exhaustion has a way of loosening even the most guarded people. At some point, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling in a way that sounded more like surrender than relief. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost as if she didn't want the walls to hear. I looked at her, unsure what she meant. "The job?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't. "The job. The hours. The way people look at me. Sometimes I feel like I've built my whole life around being untouchable. And then I go home to silence." Her words caught me off guard. I'd always seen her as unshakable, precise, confident, the kind of woman who always knew where she was going. But here, in the quiet, she wasn't the boss. She was simply a woman carrying more weight than she let anyone see. I wanted to say something profound, something that would ease the heaviness in her eyes. But nothing I thought of seemed right. So instead, I let instinct guide me. Slowly, carefully, I reached across the table and rested my hand over hers. She stilled, her eyes flicking down to where our hands met. For a moment, I worried I had crossed a line. But she didn't pull away. Her skin felt warm beneath mine, her pulse steady, though her breath had quickened. The contact was simple, just my hand over hers, but it carried more than words could. It said, "You don't have to be untouchable with me." She looked at me then, her gaze softer than I'd ever seen it. "You're too young to understand this kind of loneliness," she whispered, almost to herself. I shook my head gently. Loneliness doesn't ask about age. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was delicate, fragile, like glass that might shatter if either of us moved too quickly. We didn't kiss. We didn't embrace. But when she finally let out a quiet laugh, shaky, vulnerable, human, it felt like the most intimate moment of my life. Because in that small exchange, she had given me something far rarer than affection. She had given me her truth. The night of her confession lingered with me for days. I kept replaying the way her voice trembled, the way her hand had stayed beneath mine instead of pulling away. Every time I passed her in the hallway, I could feel the shift between us, invisible to everyone else, but impossible for us to ignore. It all came to a head one evening when I walked her to her car. The office parking lot was nearly empty, the air cool with the faint bite of autumn. She carried herself with the same poise as always, heels clicking softly against the pavement, but I could sense the weariness beneath her steps. We reached her car, and instead of unlocking the door immediately, she lingered by the driver's side, turning to face me. The glow of the street lamp caught in her hair, casting shadows that made her look softer, almost fragile. "Thank you for staying late again," she said. Her tone was calm, professional even, but her eyes told a different story. They lingered on mine, searching, questioning. I shrugged gently. I didn't mind. Besides, you shouldn't have to do everything alone. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, silence filled the space between us. Not the silence of professionalism, not the quiet of routine, but a silence thick with everything unspoken. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her body. She didn't move back. If anything, she tilted her face just slightly, as though drawn forward against her better judgment. My pulse thundered in my chest. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing but her eyes, her breath, the quiet anticipation in the space between us. We hovered there, suspended, waiting. My lips were inches from hers, and I swear I could feel the faint brush of her breath against my skin. And then, just as the moment was about to break, she whispered, almost desperately, "We shouldn't." Her words hit like a cold rush of air, but her eyes betrayed her. They didn't look away. They stayed locked on mine, wide, vulnerable, filled with a desire she couldn't allow herself to voice. Slowly, she stepped back, her composure returning in fragments, piece by piece. "Good night," she said, her voice steadier now, though softer than usual. I nodded, but inside, I knew the truth, the kiss hadn't happened, yet. But it lived there, in the charged silence, in the memory of her nearness. And it was only a matter of time before neither of us could deny it anymore. The days after that night were different. Nothing had been said outright, but the space between us was charged in a way that made every glance feel heavier, every word more deliberate. I caught myself watching her in meetings, the way she adjusted her glasses, the way her eyes flickered toward me when she thought no one noticed. And when our hands brushed by accident, neither of us rushed to move away anymore. Still, there was distance. A quiet hesitation that lingered between us, as though we were both afraid of what would happen if we let the moment finally unfold. It happened on a Friday evening. The office had emptied, shadows stretched long across the floor, and she called me into her office with a voice that carried something different, not the clipped professionalism I knew so well, but something quieter. Almost nervous. She stood by the window, arms folded lightly across her chest, staring out at the city lights. When she turned to face me, I saw a vulnerability in her expression that stopped me in my tracks. "I told myself what happened the other night was a mistake," she began softly. "That we crossed a line we shouldn't have. But the truth is," she paused, her voice catching for just a second. "The truth is, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." My chest tightened. For so long, I'd wanted to hear those words, but now that they were here, they felt almost unreal. I stepped closer, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. "I don't want to keep pretending," she whispered, her eyes fixed on mine, unguarded now. "But if this is wrong, if you don't," I didn't let her finish. Gently, carefully, I closed the space between us and drew her into my arms. For a moment, she resisted, not because she didn't want it, but because she had spent years teaching herself not to need it. And then, slowly, she let go. Her head rested against my chest, her arms slipping around my waist, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against mine. She exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and surrender, and I knew in that moment she wasn't my boss, or some untouchable figure. She was simply a woman, strong, beautiful, and finally allowing herself to be vulnerable with me. We didn't need grand declarations. That embrace was enough. It said everything words couldn't. She was no longer just, "ma'am." She was mine. And I was hers. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more age gap romance stories. And tell me in the comments, do you believe a connection like this can truly happen in real life?